Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I'm Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged. I want to open this episode today just expressing my frustration and certainly my condemnation of the arrest and harassment of Mahmoud and Ahmed Muda of the educational bookstore in Jerusalem. Mahmoud is not only a friend, but has been a guest of the podcast at least twice. And if by any chance you don't know the educational bookstore, please go back and listen to that amazing interview. Today my guest is Erik Freas, and Erik is the editor of Palestine's Christians and the Nationalist Cause, the Late Ottoman and Mandatory Periods. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Erik, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, let's start talking about yourself, since you're the editor of this work, but also want to ask about the origins of this volume.
So I'm a associate professor at the Borough Manhattan Community College, City University of New York. And so as I suppose is particularly relevant to this book, my background is in modern Middle East history. And the origins of this book is, to be honest, it started off that I had some leftover chapters from a previous book on which I had been discussing Christian communities in Palestine as of the turn of the century. And one of the chapters provided an overview of the various communities as of that time, and it occurred to me that it might be a nice starting point for an anthology on Palestine's Christians. And I also had another chapter dealing with the role of Zionism in the formulation of Palestinian national identity, and it occurred to me that might also find a home in such a volume. And then I started reaching out to some colleagues who I knew worked on the same subject matter, and one thing led to another, and eventually we had enough people who were interested, and before long we were able to pull together this book.
And the book brings together, obviously representing the diversity of the co-authors and the contributors, chapters discussing religion and nationalism. And I was wondering if you can speak about this approach and also the historical context into which the chapters are developed.
What was kind of interesting is this kind of question concerning the role of Islam in the formulation of Arab national identity reflects, I think, a particular interest of my own. And this is something that has informed some of the other books I've worked on. It's also kind of something I'm interested in a more phenomenological sense. So not just with respect to Islam and Arab national identity. It's not like a specifically Islamic or Middle Eastern thing. And in fact, I would say it's extremely relevant to much of what we're seeing happening in the world today. If we think about various populist movements, where religion has become something of a marker of who should be included in various national groupings. If we think about the role of Hinduism in India, Orthodoxy in Russia, we could even talk about Christian nationalism in this country and so forth. What's interesting is when I solicited other authors, I didn't tell them what they should write about. They came with their own projects. But as luck would have it, I think a lot of these chapters ended up being very complementary to one another. And many of these books also ended up touching on the same theme. So not necessarily that we were all in agreement about the place of Islam with respect to the formulation of Palestinian Arab national identity, or in terms of how it informed the role of Palestinian Christians in the national movement. And the other thing that actually worked out quite nicely is the various chapters came together in a way that kind of worked pretty well chronologically. With my chapter kind of beginning in the late Ottoman period, and then the other chapters taking us through to the end of the mandatory period. And then the final chapter bringing us to the present, but in a way, I think, that kind of pulled together many of the different themes that were covered in the previous chapters and kind of showed how they're still relevant to much of what's happening today. So I was really quite happy with that. And so that was kind of, just a very fortunate development. That wasn't something planned. And, of course, all the various authors have their own particular focuses as far as their own research and so forth. And, and they had probably in many cases were already working on certain topics as far as what they ended up contributing to the anthology. But that, in a sense, that worked out very well. And then, with the introduction, the conclusion, you try to see how you can tie together all the different chapters and show where they intersect. So in that way, I think it worked out pretty well.
It did. And actually, as you mentioned, what is interesting is that you have chapters that may have different views, at least in terms of understanding, the question of Islam and Christianity in relation to nationalism. And so exactly my question is this one. If you can talk a little bit about how Islam and Christianity relate to nationalism and how this topic has been developed throughout the book.
Well, I should be clear, too. I when I talk about religion as somehow informing national identity, I usually mean it in kind of more cultural or civilizational sense, as defining very often a set of shared values. So it really doesn't often have much to do with, to what extent people are committed to their faith in the sense of having a very strong theological conviction about their faith, or how often they practice their faith, how often they go to mosque or church. But it can very often act as a marker of inclusion or exclusion. And so, for instance, I think we see that happening a lot right now in India with respect to the Muslim communities there, where the fact of being Muslim actually, in some sense, diminishes to what extent you're considered to be part of Indian national identity. We see that with Muslim communities in Myanmar. Definitely this has been a problem in the United States. If you think about, a really good example was when there was this attempt when Obama was running for president, and then even after he became president, to try and challenge his Americanness by claiming that he was in fact Muslim. And the idea was that, by virtue of being Muslim, somehow he was less American. And that, simply was sufficient to basically promote that idea. You didn't really have to say anything beyond that. So in the case of Palestinian national identity, I think it's pretty clear that historically there's always been a strong relationship between Islam and Arab national identity. And in other works that I've come out with, I've discussed how early on in the period in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when Arab national identity was still being formulated. And, this is a period when this was happening in many parts of the world, when national identities were still being worked out, the actual details of what it meant to be a particular member of a nation, what qualified you, what were the characteristics that defined someone as part of a nation. In the case of Arab national identity, I feel that there were kind of two models that emerged, one that was kind of a more secular model and one that was more tied to Islam. And the Islamic model, or the one where Islam played a more prominent role, I've referred to as the Salafi model, because it was very much tied to movements of Islamic reform during the late 19th century, usually associated with individuals like Muhammad Abduh and Muhammad Rashid Ridda. And one aspect of that reform movement that emerged was the idea that the Arab people had a special role to play in the reform of Islam as a whole, that they represented, in a sense, the Muslim community par excellence, that they had been the ones that had, when the Arabs had been in control of the Islamic world, this had been kind of the glory period, if you will, of Islamic civilization, and that everything had actually gone wrong when other peoples had come into the region, had come to dominate politically the Islamic world, and therefore the Arabs had a special role to play in its reform. And so this became kind of a defining aspect of Arab identity, but again, in a kind of more civilizational sense, right? So it could be inclusive of non-Muslims. particularly Christians, in theory, even Jews, but I think the emergence of Zionism ended up precluding them because that basically ended up drawing Jews in a different direction. But you also have this kind of more secular model where, I mean, Islam is important, but not as a defining element of Arab identity, where it's just one of many different characteristics that define who is a member of the Arab nation. Probably more important would be language, shared culture, shared history, but Islam, of course, is a very important part of that. And I would argue that these two different conceptions, broadly speaking, have often been in contention with one another. National identities are never a fixed thing, right? I mean, they're always, in a sense, in flux, and they're always being contested by the various different peoples who might claim them. And so depending upon which period in time that you're actually focusing on, I would argue that the one or the other model tended to be dominant, right? It's never a case of one completely overwhelming the other and becoming the sole understanding of what constitutes a particular people, right? And again, I think this is not something unique to Arab national identity. I think you can see this happening with respect to many other national identities. I think a lot of scholars are starting to recognize scholars who focus on nationalism. There used to be a tendency to see nationalism as somehow inherently secular, and somehow they tended to set it in opposition to religious identities. And now we're starting to realize, really for the last few decades, to be honest, that it's not quite that simple, that there's really a lot of overlap between the two things. And that, in fact, religion can very often inform to a great extent, certainly proto-nationalist identities that very often lay the foundation for the emergence later on of national identities, but even continuing to inform national identities until now. And in many cases, perhaps becoming much more prominent than they had been a few decades ago. So with the case of Arab national identity, I think, for instance, during the 1920s, I think particularly in Palestine, the more secular conception of Arab national identity was much more prominent. And that's something I talk about in the second chapter of this anthology. And I think a major factor in that particular instance was Zionism. Because I think Zionism, in a sense, defined a kind of common enemy that was equally alien to both Christians and Muslims. Certainly culturally, linguistically, but I would even argue religiously, in the sense that, Zionists as Jews were something equally different from Christians and Muslims. And this is something you see, for instance, in a lot of the primary sources, particularly letters of petition, so forth, where they define Palestinian identity very often based on the commonalities of Muslims and Christians, the fact that they have equal claim to Palestine, and the fact that they are equally different from Jews, that Jews are distinctly foreign to Palestine, though partly because the Jews are referring to are European Jews. So they tie it also culturally to the fact of their being European. They often sometimes link it to certain ideologies that they associated them with, like Bolshevism and so forth. All of these things became kind of entangled with one another. But I think you could make a pretty good case that during the 1920s, that the unity between Christians and Muslims was probably at its strongest during the mandatory period, at least. I would argue that later on during the 50s and 60s, it becomes quite strong again.
Now, you already mentioned a few things about your first two chapters, and I really want to go back to chapter one, where essentially you talk about Palestine's Christian communities at the turn of the 20th century.
Well, I think part of that was, as I mentioned, that was a chapter that I had already written and was unable to use in the volume I had previously written. But I also thought it would be nice to, in writing this book, not to assume that the reader already is familiar with the basic terrain, so to speak, right? So it would be nice to kind of start off by providing a basic overview of the demographics, if you will, and basic background regarding the various Christian communities in Palestine, that then would, hopefully would help the reader to make better sense of the ensuing chapters as they move forward. And I found it very interesting, too, just trying to actually get a handle on the actual demographics, given the certain limitations you have to work with in terms of the lack of proper censuses, and in terms of the kind of changes that were taking place on the ground. The late 19th, early 20th century, there's a lot of transformation happening, particularly economically, growing European presence. People are moving quite a bit. You have a lot of people moving into Palestine, but also people moving within Palestine, particularly from the center to the coast. It would seem that Christians in particular were very mobile during this period. A lot of this related to the economic changes that were taking place, so I tried to cover some of that in the chapter. So basically setting the scene might be one way of putting it. Right, so that as you go on with the other chapters, you kind of have a starting reference point. And I hope I achieved that. Obviously, all of us who were contributing to this book, at some point you're so familiar with the basic history that it's hard to put yourself in the position of someone reading the book who maybe, arrives at the book without having any basic background at all. I guess you try to find the balance, providing enough information, but maybe not more than is necessary. And I hope I found the right balance in that regard.
Now, in chapter 2, you move then to discuss the impact of Zionism on Muslim-Christian relations that you already mentioned in Palestine. And most of the focus is on the question of Christian response to Zionism, which looked different, stranger than of a Muslim counterpart. But as you show, this was a false narrative. Can you speak about how this misinterpretation influenced our understanding of Muslim-Christian relations?
I think the biggest misunderstanding, though, I think among scholars, I think this misunderstanding has pretty much been put to rest for some time now. But I think Beshka's contribution with this chapter, Emanuel Beshka, is really very important because it substantiates what was problematic with this perspective. So the perspective, I think, that has kind of hung around, certainly it is actively promoted in media at times and in the popular imagination that somehow the Muslim majority population initially was acquiescent to Zionism or even accepting of it, and that really it was only Christians that had a problem with it, and that eventually it was because of them that Muslims turned against it. I think that is a kind of misconception that was actively promoted, even in the scholarship initially. I think, for a while now, we've known that's not the case. But it is something you still hear being promoted in kind of popular discussion, right? I mean, you hear sometimes people, I guess, who claim to be representing Israeli interests who are promoting the idea that, Palestinians didn't really have a problem with this until certain malcontents made trouble or something along those lines. And that certainly is not the case. And so I think Beshka, basically what he did is he looked at a number of different newspapers from the late Ottoman period, to be more precise, the Second Constitutional period. So this would have been from roughly 1908 up until 1914. And so this is a period after censorship had been lifted on the press. First of all, he does discuss a bit what evidence we have of opposition to Zionism before that. But of course, because there was censorship, we have only limited sources, right, in terms of what we're able to tell. But we do find evidence of opposition, but certainly much more evidence after 1908. And he does a kind of comparative analysis of Christian newspapers versus Muslim-edited newspapers. Now, the thing is, the majority of newspapers during this period were run by Christians, and there are a number of various reasons for that, that he discusses. So that is part of the reason I think there was kind of a misconception that, it was primarily Christians that opposed Zionism initially. But what's really interesting, he does demonstrate, I think, fairly effectively that if you look at the situation more carefully in a comparative way, he's able to demonstrate that, first of all, you did have some Christian newspapers that were even pro-Zionist. One in particular that he looks at is Al Nafir. Certainly probably the most vociferously Anti-Zionist newspaper Al Karmal was definitely Christian run, right? So, I mean, that's probably the most famous one. But Philistine, which often is considered to be very anti-Zionist, actually started out being very ambiguous about it. And that's something I think most people aren't aware of. So this is definitely something, new as far as adding to the scholarly literature on the subject. And then you have the Muslim edited paper, trying to remember the name, Al-Munadi, which was really strongly anti-Zionist right from the start. And then on top of that, there are a number of political figures who were speaking in the Ottoman Parliament or who had political positions within the local administration who were, very much on record as opposing Zionism. So, and in fact, you don't really have any Christian figures equivalent to that that you can really point to who were, speaking out against Zionism as functionaries of the Ottoman government, right? So, I mean, it's a much more complex picture. Certainly, there's very little evidence that somehow you really find very little evidence of Muslims supporting Zionism. And it's really kind of hard to substantiate the idea that they were indifferent to it. And then you find evidence that, in fact, they were opposed to it. Now, of course, the majority of Palestinians at this time were peasants. I mean, they were from the peasantry, the Fellahin. So, yeah, many of them were not particularly politically conscious, but we find plenty of evidence that they had their own issues, particularly related to land acquisition that very often created hardships for them. So even on that level, it's kind of hard to say that somehow they were indifferent to Zionism. But very often for them, it might not have been a political issue yet, but eventually it will be. So I think that chapter is very important in terms of demonstrating that this was not like a Christian thing at the beginning, and then only later, because of Christians, Muslims somehow became part of the movement of opposition to Zionism.
Now, Emanuel Beshka, and I want to remind the listeners that he published several important works analyzing Philistine, is also introducing a question, and the question is about anti-Semitism. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about this particular point.
That might be where we're not entirely in agreement. I think it's kind of hard to dispute that anti-Semitism was a factor driving Christian opposition, but not the only one. And very often it is the case that, it's not just any one thing that is informing someone's position, even political position about a particular concern, in this case, Zionism. But you do find plenty of evidence that anti-Semitism was definitely a factor. But then, even in that regard, I think you have to make distinctions based on which Christian sect you're talking about, also which time period you're talking about. Early on, it seems much more prominent among Latin Catholics. Later on, it does seem to become much more of an issue with the Orthodox community. I think one factor in that is, that it begins to spread, but also you start to have a much stronger Russian missionary presence. And, I don't think I really need to debate the reality of anti-Semitism in Russia in the late 19th century. Let's face it, if there's already a strong hostility directed towards Zionism, it's not too hard to see how anti-Semitism might gain traction in that kind of an environment, right? So it's more, I think, the case that to the extent that anti-Semitism eventually even spreads to the Muslim community, I think it's more because of anti-Zionism than a case of, anti-Zionism being a consequence of anti-Semitism, right? I mean, it just provides a kind of fertile ground for anti-Semitism, for the seed of anti-Semitism to grow. But having said that, I should note, particularly among more educated Palestinians, for instance, the editors of Philistine, they very often make a very strong effort to make a distinction between Zionists and Jews, to take a stand against obvious anti-Semitism, And for instance, to make it clear, we don't have a problem with indigenous Palestinian Jews. Our problem is with Zionist European settlers who are coming here and who are acquiring land and who are dispossessing members of the peasantry and so forth, right? So again, it's a very complex picture. But if I were going to kind of try and paint with a broad brushstroke what's going on, I'd say ultimately the problem is Zionism, right? Zionism is basically creating a fertile ground for the spread of anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism that's driving opposition to Zionism, broadly speaking.
Now, let's move to the chapter by Nicholas Roberts. It tackles one of the most important issues of British Palestine, sectarianism. Now, for the British, sectarianism was a natural feature of Palestine. This is how they saw the region. So a classical colonial view. And I should add, this is like not just related to Palestine, but to basically all imperial lands controlled by the British, particularly in the Middle East. Can you talk about the religious system created by the British and how it affected religious relations?
I think this is a really important chapter because to the extent that most people are familiar with the kind of administrative system that the British set up, and even if you're just reading a basic historical work about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so forth, it very often is presented as if the British are just perpetuating something that already existed on the ground. And certainly that's how the British presented it, right? So, they basically argue that they were just promoting a religious system that was rooted in Ottoman practice that we often refer to as the religious status quo, right? That supposedly dates back to an Ottoman firman, a religious ruling dating back to 1757 about the management of the various religious communities and holy sites, whereby the various, it really applied to the non-Muslim religious communities that would allow them a certain degree of autonomy in managing their own affairs. And it also determined who had control over which religious sites. And that was especially relevant to Palestine, given the various Christian, but also Jewish holy sites that you have there. And very often it was especially relevant with respect to Christian holy sites, because very often, you had various Christian sects that very often disputed who should have control. Who should have control over which holy site or even which part of a particular church or monastery or shrine and so forth. And I'm sure you're very familiar that, very often there would be, these disputes would become quite physical. You have monks basically getting into brawls over, who should be allowed to stand where or who could put a nail in which wall and so forth. So they basically claim that what they were setting up was based on that. But in fact, a lot of what they instituted was innovative, was completely of their own creation. And in fact, very much modeled, and I think Roberts demonstrates this quite well, on policies created elsewhere, particularly in India and Africa, right? And as you pointed out, based on the idea that ultimately these people define themselves based on their religious identities, as Muslim, as Christian, as Jew, not as Palestinian Arab. Now, I would point out, and I think Roberts would probably agree, that to some degree the British were sincere in their belief that this is how they understood their identities, but it had a very useful side to it, because this was a good way basically to keep people divided. It made it much easier to control them, right? Rather than having them united in opposition to British rule as Palestinian Arabs, you had them divided into separate groups based on their religious identities. So what are some of the innovations that they came up with? So during the Ottoman period, the Christians and Jews, and I should say the various Christian sects, would have been defined as millets. So a millet is basically, the idea that as a millet, you're a semi-autonomous nation that is allowed to basically manage your own internal affairs, right? You're subject to your own laws as long as you pay your taxes and you accepted the overarching authority of the Ottoman government. You were fine, right? So you would have had a Jewish millet, you would have had an Orthodox millet, you would have had a Armenian Orthodox millet, I should say, Greek Orthodox millet. Latin Catholics weren't exactly millet. They had kind of a different status, but it was somewhat equivalent to that. Eventually a Protestant millet and so forth. There was never a Muslim millet, though. Muslims constituted the mainstream. The British are now going to define the Muslims as a millet. And this is entirely an innovation. In connection with that, they are going to also create an entirely new institution called the Supreme Muslim Council for the management of waqfs, religious endowments. And so this really is, in a sense, instead of Muslims constituting the mainstream, which in this case, during the Ottoman Empire would have been Ottoman, in this case might have transformed into Palestinian Arab, which eventually might have been inclusive of Christians. They are now defined as Muslim in a much more fixed manner. The Supreme Muslim Council also ends up operating as a kind of Palestinian government, but one that is also Islamic. So again, making it very difficult for it to be representative of all Palestinian Arabs. This also, according to Roberts, and I agree with him, will serve to Islamicize the Palestinian nationalist movement as we get into the 1930s, also partly because it is going to strengthen one particular political actor, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who is made president of the Supreme Muslim Council, and is also given the title of Grand Mufti, which is another invented position. This is basically to imply that he has ultimate religious authority in Palestine. There had never been a Grand Mufti. There had been a Mufti of Jerusalem, and that would have been a prestigious position to be sure, but it wouldn't have given him this level of authority over the entirety of Palestine. Right. So this is, both in a way working to divide Muslims and Christians, and also in a sense Islamicizing the national movement, even while strengthening Haj Amin al-Husseini, who now has an interest in promoting the Islamicizing of the movement, because this serves to strengthen his position politically with respect to his political rivals. I mean, the more it becomes Islamicized, the stronger his position. And there are other ways in which the British is going to interfere with the so-called status quo that reflect new inventions that are basically innovations on what had existed during Ottoman times. The taking of censuses, and the censuses are not going to be of Arab versus Jews. It's Muslims, Christians, and Jews, right? So another way of strengthening that division. The policing of religious sites, very often using Indians, like Muslims coming from other parts of the British Empire. Hiring practices based on whether someone is Muslim or Christian, which coming into the late 1920s is going to create some resentments on the part of Muslims who feel that Christians are being favored for administrative positions. And so that's going to prove a bit divisive. The British, there was some sectarianism on the ground of which the British are taking advantage. It's not as if there wasn't anything there with which to work, but they are certainly exploiting that and exacerbating that. And I'm not sure this was even in their best interest in a way, right? Later on, this, in a sense, they also don't have someone with whom to work later on the Palestinian side that could be representative of the population, but in a more secular way. That might have been helpful when you get into the 1940s. And then, they were trying to work on some kind of partition plan and so forth. But in any event, right, I think Roberts does a pretty good job of demonstrating how a lot of this really is a British invention, and a lot of the sectarianism can be attributed to them ultimately. So kind of what if? How might have things gone if they hadn't actively promoted sectarianism in this manner? And it's a very interesting question, I think. But, you can't be counterfactual in history, ultimately.
And I want to move forward with the next chapter that essentially is providing another layer and another set of lenses to look at Muslim-Christian relations. So Noah Hyde-Dugdale introduces the question of intersectionality in order to contextualize and understand Muslim-Christian relations in mandatory Palestine. Can you speak about the author's approach, and also what are his findings?
I really love this chapter, and I think it's kind of nice that it's situated in the middle because, by that point you might become too comfortable with thinking that the only division that really matters is between Muslim and Christian. And so intersectionality kind of reminds us, so it's a very theoretical chapter in a sense, right? But it kind of reminds us that there are many other kinds of divisions that inform how people understand their identity. The people wear many different pairs of shoes, right? That they put on depending on the situation, right? So a lot of, how people identify themselves, first of all, is very situational. And very often people identify themselves in multiple ways in any given moment. He doesn't dispute that the Muslim-Christian division is not relevant. But in order to really fully appreciate how it works, you have to look at it in the context of other kinds of divisions in terms of identity that reflect, for instance, political rivalries, whether like there was the main political rivalry in Palestine for much of the mandate was between the Husseinis and Nashashibis. Where you fell within that political rivalry in terms of who you supported, that might inform your behavior in conjunction with whether you were Muslim or Christian to some degree or another, or might have basically overridden that division so that it became irrelevant. Other divisions, social status, whether living in the city or whether living in the countryside, denominational differences, whether Latin Catholic versus Orthodox versus Protestant, economic circumstances, whether among the merchant elite, whether a peasant, whether among the professional class, and so forth. And, then putting those different identities, bases of identities, and then considering them within different situations, the circumstances related to those situations. All of that informs the behavior of historical actors. And so I really found this particular chapter extremely important. I think it comes at the right moment in the anthology because, kind of like, okay, we've been talking a lot about this particular division, but we need kind of to remind ourselves that it is not the only division that matters. And so he borrowed this theoretical framework it began with feminist studies. I mean, I should note, by the time we're using it, it's been borrowed by other people as well. Initially, it was used, though, to address the exclusion of Black women from white feminist discourse, primarily by showing that the manner in which Black women were frequently marginalized was both as women and even as Black in feminist circles. Right, so they have different identities, and how they were engaged very often depended on who they were interacting with, basically, right? So the basic idea is that we all have multiple bases of identity. In that particular case, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. All of those things have to be accounted for in order to understand individual experience, right? In order to understand how people are behaving, right? So, I mean, historians, in a sense, we're trying to understand why people behaved a certain way in a given situation. And in our particular case, for those historians especially interested in Palestinian Christians and how they interacted with Muslims, we have to be very careful not to see everything as being determined by the fact of being Christian or being a Christian minority population in within a larger Muslim population. And that becomes, something you can just, in a sense, begin doing almost unconsciously, right? So there's one example I thought that really demonstrated this quite nicely. At the end of the chapter, he talks about members of the Union of Arab Orthodox Christians, which ostensibly was a religious organization. I mean, most of the activities they engaged in, on the face of it, were religious activities. Sometimes Bible studies, sometimes charity works in connection with churches and so forth. So he talks about, at one point, they're having a debate about what their emblems should be and whether they should include a cross or not. And, the various members take various positions. And if the only thing you're thinking about is, you're only thinking about them as Christians living within a Muslim majority population, then the likelihood is you're going to think, well, their only concern is about maybe whether they're going to offend their Muslim compatriots. But in fact, if you start thinking about the various participants in that debate based on their age, their social class, their political inclinations, the levels of their education, you kind of start realizing there's a lot more going on here, right? A lot of it has to do, first of all, the emblem is really more intended to be a nationalistic symbol, right? So a lot of it has to do with how they understand their national identity. And a lot of that probably has more to do with their education level, their social status, their age, than with the fact that they're Christian. Though their being Christian probably is also a factor, right? In terms of, though, how much they want that to be represented within a nationalist symbol. He also looks at the slogan, or I should say anthem, of their organization, of the Union of Arab Orthodox Christians. It uses the term jihad, for instance. But if you look at it at the context of the entire anthem, clearly they're using it in a nationalistic manner. At the same time, they never mention the word Christian or Orthodox. But, I mean, there's very little indication if we look at various other statements, activities, and so forth, various pronouncements, that in some way they're hiding the fact that they're a Christian organization, right? So again, I mean, to fully understand the motivation behind, the decision process involved in, how they came up with their anthem, how they came up with their emblem, you're really not going to have a full appreciation of the various factors involved in that decision-making process if you just base it solely on this kind of Christian-Muslim division. Particularly in the 1940s, this is a period, we might add, during, after which most of the Palestinian leadership, national leadership, had been sent into exile. So there's also like this huge vacuum in that regard that everyone, all Palestinians, are trying to fill, right? And trying to figure out how best to do it and how to, kind of create a sense of unity. So there are a host of factors involved. And it's very misleading, again, if you just rely on this Muslim-Christian division as a basis for understanding why people are making the decisions they are, why they're behaving the way they are. And so to me, that was the value of intersectionality. And it's something I should say I'm thinking a lot more about with respect to a book that I'm currently working on. It's just really, something that it's worth kind of always having in the back of your head, as you move forward with whatever topic you're doing, if you're a historian, I think.
And I want to move to a Charles Anderson chapter. He writes about the role of Christians in the Arab Revolt of 1936. Historiography seems to have left the Christians out of the picture as the British pushed the belief of the Islamization of Palestinian politics, which you mentioned earlier. Can you speak about the Palestinian Christian role in the revolt?
I think Anderson does a great job challenging the conventional narrative regarding the marginalization of Christians during the in the Palestinian national movement during the 1930s, and particularly with respect to the Arab Revolt between 36 and 39. Now, I don't know if I fully agree with him that their role did not diminish somewhat relative to what it had been during the 1920s. I think that's kind of a hard case to make. But I think he does a really great job in demonstrating that it's a much more nuanced situation than is often conveyed in the literature until now. Usually, if you're reading any account of the Arab Revolt, it tends to, I don't know, Christians feel like a kind of footnote just kind of thrown in there. And it's just kind of taken as a given that they really play no role at all in the Arab Revolt. And I think he makes a pretty clear case that, that's going too far in the other direction, to kind of suggest that they had no role at all. He certainly makes a pretty good case that Christians definitely were committed to the national movement during this period, that they certainly felt very much involved in the movement. They felt very much Palestinian Arab. That goes without question. And certainly he makes a very, very strong case that they suffered as much as Muslims at the hand of the British response, during the time of the Arab Revolt. Whether they were as active among the Arab leadership of the Arab Revolt, I think that it still seems pretty apparent that they were not. So that becomes, that's something I don't think I'm not sure he was really trying to say that that was the case anyway. He does also demonstrate that as far as the idea that the movement became Islamicized during this period, he kind of demonstrates pretty nicely that it's also kind of not just about Islam. It's also about non-elites becoming much more prominent versus elite during this period. So I would suggest that there's kind of an overlap between these two things, right? The idea that as it became more a kind of rural movement involving the peasantry, and they became the more dominant element, in part, that's why it also became kind of more, it took on a more Islamic color, if you will. But it's kind of, again, kind of, let's say a more informal understanding of Islam, but it's also during a period where Islam is becoming more formalized, right? Where there are certain individuals who are promoting a kind of more rigid interpretation of Islam. But for most peasants, I think Islam is still understood as corresponding to kind of a traditional way of life, how we do things in the country and so forth. And given that they've become more prominent in leading the national movement, in as much as they are kind of the main element of the Arab Revolt, and in many ways they are imposing certain elements of how they live their life on the urban elite as a way of demonstrating their commitment to the cause. Probably the most notable example that they should no longer wear the tarbush and should wear the kafia, right, which is kind of the traditional headgear of the countryside. I think, in a sense, that is why there's this kind of sensibility of it becoming a much more Islamicized movement. It's a combination of that, the peasantry becoming much more prominent, kind of imposing to some degree certain traditional elements on the urban elite in an attempt also to diminish their authority and challenge it. But also at the same time, you have this kind of movement to formalize Islam among the peasantry. So all these things are kind of going on together at the same time. And then we might add to that during this period, Haj Amin al-Husseini has become kind of the most dominant political figure during the 1930s. And again, as head of the Supreme Muslim Council, Grand Mufti, is kind of in his interest to, in a sense, emphasize the Islamic character of the movement, of Palestinian identity, of Palestine, his tendency to emphasize the need to defend the Haram al-Sharif as a major aspect of the movement and so forth. So all of these things together, I think, are part of this kind of perception that the movement has become much more Islamic in color. And I do think this does become a bit of a concern for Christians, something I think that becomes very evident in the chapter by Johnny Mansour. If we look at some of the testimonies made by Christians before the various commissions that begin to appear in Palestine towards the end of the mandate.
And I want to move to these two chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8. Chapter 7 by Sarah Irving and Karen Sanchez, and then, as you mentioned, chapter 8 by Johnny Mansour. And they bring into the narrative of the book personal stories. So chapter 7 looks at Nicola Khoury, particularly his journey to the League of Nations. And I also want to remind the listeners that I recorded a longer interview with the authors in 2022 for the New Books Network, discussing with more details the story of Nicola Khoury. While chapter 8, in chapter 8, Mansour looks at Christian writings, and you mentioned testimonies, in particular testimonies given to the Peel Commission. And I was wondering if you can summarize both chapters and tell us the importance of looking at individuals.
Well, I think after having a few chapters that deal with broader historical developments, even one that's kind of more theoretical in terms of its subject matter, it's kind of nice to have a couple of chapters that take it down to the personal level. And in a way, I think that complement very nicely some of the various themes that are developed in the preceding chapters. The one by Irving and Sanchez on Nicola Khoury I found very interesting because in some ways it works very nice with this idea of intersectionality, among other things. Because as he traveled across Europe on the way to the League of Nations, he really utilized both his identity as a Palestinian Arab on behalf of the national movement, but also as an Orthodox Christian, both on behalf of the what was an internal struggle within the Orthodox community of the laity versus the Greek-speaking clergy, but which also was kind of a national struggle. They wanted to Arabicize, the church. But also in service of the national struggle. And so these two different identities complemented each other quite nicely. And in a sense, he really moves back and forth between these two identities quite fluidly, in a way that it's almost as if they're really kind of two sides of the same coin, right? It's not this kind of sensibility that, there are two separate things. And I don't think he even understood his identity as a Palestinian or his involvement in the national movement as somehow something distinct from his identity as an Orthodox Christian or his religious concerns, that these two things were interlocked. In fact, I mean, I'm pretty sure of this because I've read the work by Irving and Sanchez connected with this chapter. And so this is something they actually explore, and it's quite clear that there's not this idea that that I'm this, but I'm also that. These two things are interlinked, they're interconnected. This also made him quite comfortable when engaging with important Muslim leaders, something he did on the way back to Palestine when he stopped off in Cairo, for instance. And so he would represent the Palestinian nationalist cause as an Orthodox Christian and as a Palestinian Arab, which was, I think this is a really good example of intersectionality and, kind of showing how many of the themes developed in the preceding chapters operate on the ground, right, in practice. As far as the testimonies, I think this showed, I should mention one other thing with Irving and Sanchez, that at the end of the chapter, in a kind of comparative way, they also look at some of what was going on in the Latin Catholic community with respect to the national movement, in a comparative way with respect to the Orthodox community. The Orthodox community, I think, was much more actively engaged with the national movement, arguably, than the Latin Catholic community. And that's something that kind of comes across in the chapter. And also maybe that the Latin Catholic community was much more tied to the Latin Catholic worldwide community and its related institutions in a way that it sometimes felt as if they were taking their cue from the Vatican. And it's kind of an interesting thing that they really only touch on it briefly in the chapter, but it would be interesting to explore that further. Orthodox Christians, some would argue that they were the most committed as a community to the national cause. They certainly were the largest Christian community in Palestine. And I briefly mentioned they had kind of an internal issue where they were trying to Arabicize the church, and that they generally saw that as very much connected to the broader nationalist cause. Right, it's kind of an element of the nationalist cause that was directly impacting their community, and that's generally how they would present it. But coming to the chapter by Mansour, so it speaks to a number of things, I think. So he talks about the various testimonies that took place, the presentations made by Christians before various committees, starting with the early part of the mandate, but mostly with respect to the Peel Commission, which took place during the Arab Revolt, and then following up through to the end of the mandate. And so you kind of see like a pattern in terms of certain, I think, growing concerns, one of which is a perception that Islam is becoming more prominent as an element of the national movement. So I think that's kind of something that you find evident in his chapter. So there were kind of two things that really stood out for me in the testimonies. At one point, the possibility was raised of whether Christians should be granted minority rights in the event that a Palestinian Arab state was created. And a lot of Christian leaders came out on record of opposing that. And the chief reason they gave is they felt that that would actually be viewed very unfavorably by their Muslim compatriots as indicating that somehow they were not embracing fully their Arab identity. And I found that quite interesting. This was a genuine concern they had. And the other thing I found interesting was that a few of them spoke out strongly on the need for a secular Palestinian state, and that Palestinian Arab identity should be defined in as secular way as possible in order to maintain unity between Muslims and Christians. So I think both of these things speak to a concern that perhaps Islam was becoming a bit more prominent than they were comfortable with respect to the national movement, what it might imply in the event that Palestinians did eventually get an independent state, and so forth. So for me, that was one of the takeaways I got from that chapter. But I mean, you know, whatever one's takeaway, I think is kind of also important just so you had these individual Christian voices, you know, given the subject matter of the anthology.
Now, and I want to end our conversations by looking at the fabulous chapter by Elizabeth Martin discussing the concept of barakah, which means essentially holy blessing, a phenomenon experienced by both Christian and Muslim. And I wonder if you can speak about barakah and the role it played, but also keep playing in Muslim-Christian relations.
I love this chapter. And, you know, at first when she said her intention was to provide a chapter dealing more with present day developments, I was a little worried. But then when I saw it, I was like, this is great. This really feels like, you know, okay, let's bring it all up to the present. And, you know, as I read through it, I'm like, this very clearly links up with a lot of the themes that we considered in the preceding chapters. In a way, it's great. I mean, it kind of shows that a lot of them are still relevant today. And it's, you know, obviously a very well-researched chapter, very, very powerful narrative. By the way, I think I want to just shout out to Anderson. I think his chapter was brilliant in terms of, you know, the level of research and a very powerful narrative. And it's really worth highlighting that. I mean, all the chapters are great, but his is really something special in that regard. So first of all, I think the chapter does actually also speak very strongly of how Islam functioned in the past when it was kind of practiced in a much more informal way. It's something I actually wrote a chapter about, an article about 10 years ago, where I talked about how Islam used to be practiced in a much more informal way, and you had many of these kind of shrines and various practices connected with them that would very often involve non-Muslims, and there was very little concern about who took part in them, you know, whether technically the individual associated with the shrine was, you know, technically Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or maybe even pagan. Very often the origin of these individuals were pagan, even if they had been transformed into a monotheistic figure. And you know, it's kind of heartening to know that some of these things still exist, but one of the things she talks about is how there have been a number of factors that have served to diminish these practices. But before I get to that, it is worth noticing, right? Noting that many of these shrines and many of the practices associated with them are not in any proper sense Islamic, in any technical sense. And the beauty of it, I mean, they are in actual principle very ecumenical, right? So the idea is that, in a sense, it doesn't matter what religious background you have. You come there, you interact with people of other faiths, you engage in these practices, which usually are very physical, and the idea that you receive, you know, some kind of holiness in connection with that. I would note, by the way, I've participated in some of this myself when I was there, and there's just something very very beautiful about the whole experience. So, like when you're in this space engaging in these practices, there's this kind of feeling that of it completely is irrelevant what religion the other people around you belong to. You're all part of this experience, the people around you. And I think for Muslims and Christians, this is extremely important within the context of their ongoing struggle, within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That this has provided a kind of physical way of demonstrating a sense of unity. I think Martin does a really good job of also demonstrating how this has worked in a kind of more political way. For instance, many of the shrines dedicated to the Virgin Mary have taken on a kind of political symbolism. It's like that in the same way that the Virgin Mary suffered when her son Jesus was taken from the cross and had been killed, how many Palestinian mothers feel when their children die or are killed in the conflict. So I mean, what is kind of sad is that it does seem that many of these practices are diminishing. Some of the factors she talked about has been, for instance, the appropriation of these shrines in connection with nation states or national identities. One example she gave was Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, which was appropriated by Israel for the sole use of Jews. And it used to be a shrine that would have been visited by people of various religious backgrounds, and it would have been a shared site. And now, really it's been kind of also, in a sense, formalized in terms of what kind of activities permitted there, even for Jews. But it's been basically cut off from anyone who isn't Jewish. In many ways, this is the same situation with the Haram al-Sharif, though there you have two different groups trying to contest what kinds of practices can take place there. But even I remember back in the early 90s, it was a much more relaxed atmosphere when you went up there. There was a time where it served almost more as a secular promenade than as a religious site. And I think those days are long gone, where it really is just a place where people could congregate and relax and interact. And now it's people guarded very, for obvious reasons in connection with the struggle going on. And very often for nationalistic reasons, but this is where religion becomes also a marker of national identity. Where there is a concern that its religious functions should be maintained at the expense of any other kind of activity there. Another factor that she talks about is Islamic fundamentalists who very often take a very dim view of the practices associated with barakah and try to discourage it. Tending to view many of these things as heretical or just simply inappropriate and not really corresponding to right practice and belief. And then, the involvement of foreign church organizations, for instance, in connection with many of these sites, has made it very difficult for non-Christians, or in some cases, even individuals not belonging to the proper sect, to take part in the various activities associated with barakah, or at the very least, making them feel very uncomfortable to do so. Because also kind of formalizing religious practice, or, in terms of what is considered appropriate, what is permitted. So whether these kind of practices will continue, I guess is an open question. But that also kind of tied into, is kind of a nice way to finish the anthology, because it tied back into this broader theme that's at least of particular interest to me, of the relationship between national identity and religion.
So one last question, really. Looking back at the chapters of this work, can you share some conclusion with us?
Well, so for me, as I began the discussion, the broader issue for me is this kind of relationship between religion and national identity. I don't have any firm conclusions, except that I think it's not necessarily a good thing, but it's a kind of reality that has to be accommodated in some sense. As with nationalism, very often I've been asked when I've given a presentation of one sort or another, what's your opinion of nationalism in general? Never mind to what extent religion has informed it. And By and large, I tend to have a rather negative view of nationalism, but it's an extremely powerful ideology in terms of how people identify themselves. And I think, the idea that somehow you're going to eliminate it is a fool's errand. I mean, if you imagine somehow that's possible. So for me, it's more, how can you channel this way of thinking in a positive way? And I kind of feel the same way about religion right now. Religion, particularly as a kind of aspect of national identity, I don't think it's going away anytime in the near future. So the question then for me is, how do you accommodate it in a way that it's, maybe providing a foundation for more positive interaction with people, whether talking about people within the national grouping that don't belong to the majority religion, or you're talking about how you engage people, other nations, particularly if they are affiliated with other religions. So, for instance, this chapter, the last chapter by Martin, I think is an example of how religion can actually work in a positive way, in a sense of providing a space for shared interaction. And religion historically often has worked in a very negative way, but it has also worked in a positive way too. But the idea of just eliminating it, both as an important part of people's lives individually, but again as an aspect of how people identify themselves, is not going to happen. The more I study nationalism as in a phenomenological sense, or looking at how it's functioned in a particular context, Middle East or otherwise, I think it's very apparent that it's here to stay. So that's one conclusion. Another conclusion, I think, that maybe has more to do with the approach taken in this book. I kind of like the idea that while I think all of the contributors were in agreement about, many points, there were areas where we disagreed. And I actually like that. I think that's how history should work. So as you're going through this book, I would encourage a reader to, kind of see this as a reflection of how history should work. And history, in a sense, is kind of like you're sitting down at a table with other historians to join a debate that probably is already underway, where different views are being discussed, and there's some agreement, some consensus, other points upon which people disagree, people making their case. Maybe there'll never be agreement about certain points, but hopefully we come to appreciate even the positions we don't agree with, or to understand the nuances of it. Eventually new people join the discussion, some people leave. So in a way, I felt the book kind of reflected that process. And what's occurred to me of late, that a lot of people misunderstand how history works. They kind of feel that history should just, get it right and provide a finalized understanding of what happened, whatever particular history you're talking about, and stop messing around with it. And that's not how it works. There are historical facts. There are things that, at some point we kind of all decide, that's, that particular aspect of it, we're pretty much decided on it. But most of it, no. Particularly if we're talking about why things happen, why somebody did what they did. We're always going to be discussing it, always reevaluating, particularly new information comes to light, new perspectives are introduced. So I hope that is how somebody would approach the book, and appreciate even the fact that there are points where we didn't agree. So that would be, I guess, another conclusion of sorts.
This was Erik Freas. Erik is the editor of Palestine's Christians and the Nationalist Cause, the Late Ottoman and Mandatory Period. The book has been published by Routledge in 2025. Erik, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.